Welcome, fellow explorers. My name is Christian Alexandersen, and this is Hemlocks to Hellbenders, a podcast highlighting Pennsylvania's parks, forests, and great outdoors. Close your eyes. Imagine you're standing in a forest cathedral surrounded by trees that are hundreds of years old. Your feet sinking slightly into the soft ground covered in hemlock needles. The wind sways the lumbering trees and stirs the rich smell of soil around you. A woodpecker can be heard in the distance. Your heart rate lowers and you're relaxed. The stress of work, the kids, your commute completely drifts away. You are in an ancient forest, alone and at peace. Everything is beautiful and nothing hurts. Open your eyes. It was not a dream. It's an experience that's well within your reach here in Pennsylvania, thanks to the dedicated work of conservationists like the Old Growth Forest Network. Created in 2007, the Old Growth Forest Network works to identify and protect one forest in each county of the United States. As of the recording of this episode, the Old Growth Forest Network has worked with local, state, and federal agencies to identify and protect 28 ancient forests in Pennsylvania, with more on the way. They can be found in parks, forests, natural areas, wildlife preserves, and nature reserves. While the Old Growth Forest Network is working hard to identify and protect more ancient forests, these remarkable places remain under threat. Private landowners and timber companies are in possession of more old-growth forests than the public. Without conservation, their destruction is almost guaranteed. But with your help, the organization can save an old-growth forest in all 67 Pennsylvania counties. Will you help? I'm excited to welcome Sarah Adlew and Brian Kane with the Old Growth Forest Network to the podcast. Sarah is the executive director. Brian is the outreach coordinator. Sarah, Brian, thanks for joining the program.
We are so happy to be here.
Glad to be part of it, Christian.
Tell us about the Old Growth Forest Network.
Well, the Old Growth Forest Network is a national organization, and it's creating a network of old growth forests across the country. That is our major goal because we're responding to a severe degradation and lack of this stage of a forest's life, basically. So our organization is looking to fill that gap where we've lost a canopy of old growth forests across the country. So what we do is wherever forests can grow, which is about 2/3 of the country, we look to ensure that there is one protected and publicly accessible forest per county. So our organization has this generations-long mission with approximately 2,300 counties across the country that can support a forest as an ecosystem there. So we are working with on-the-ground volunteers and forest managers and woodland owners and other entities like that to identify possible areas of older forest in a county or old growth where it might remain. And then we verify that these areas are specifically protected from commercial logging. And if they aren't currently protected in that way, that's where our hard work comes in, and we work to get those protections put in place. And once a forest meets our 3 criteria of being protected from commercial logging, being publicly accessible, and exhibiting these older forest characteristics, we can induct it into the Old Growth Forest Network. When we induct a forest, that is kind of that stamp of approval of this forest will be there standing for future generations, at least in terms of the things that we can control, like development and logging. And when we induct a forest, it goes on our website and we share the story of this forest, its history, the type, the characteristics of it, the special things that you might be looking for when you go on certain trails that can take you into that older forest. So that information goes up on our website. We have a map where you can dig into all these places in your state. And then the very fun part is we get to celebrate that induction with the forest manager, the stewards of that forest, any volunteer groups, and then the community that benefits from being close to a forest like this, or the people who go out and hike it every morning and see those beautiful seasonal changes. And so coming in as a national organization to these places that can have that really intense sense of place to its neighbors is a really wonderful perk of the job and perk of our work. And I want to clarify with our organization, not all forests that get inducted into the Old Growth Forest Network are old growth, and that's because of that extreme lack that we currently see. So we do have a lot of second growth forests. we are looking for the oldest forest in a given county because that's the one that has the best chance to return to that old growth condition.
How do you define an old growth forest?
That is a tricky question. It's been a wicked problem for many people across the board who manage forests at different jurisdictions, county, state, federal. Our organization takes a very wide definition of it because we want to see the return of old growth forests. And so we want to be inclusive of forests that are aging into it. And so we don't set hard criteria for any particular oldest tree or anything like that. The way I see it is there can be as many definitions as there are forest types out there because each forest ages differently. They're kind of like people. We all look different in our old age, and we all take different paths to get there. So each ecoregion, history, soil type, disturbance type, like storms, can come in and change how a forest will look in its older age. But the overall framework of how I see old growth is it's a stage at a time when a forest has grown old enough, free from major disturbances like being clear cut or commercially logged, where individual trees are able to live out their full ecological potential. So when I say that, I mean growing from a seedling, approaching their maximum lifespan, whether that is 90 years, 150 years, 400 years. Some trees, we don't know their maximum lifespan, but we want to let them do those things. And we want to see them dying, eventually decomposing, and returning to that nutrient cycle of a forest to enrich the life that comes after it. So once you've had a cohort or a generation of trees that are able to do that, that's when I see that forest is moving into old growth. And so that's my definition. Everyone sees it a little bit differently, and pinning it down has proved impossible.
What kind of work does it take to preserve these beautiful trees?
That's another tricky question because a lot of it depends on who is the owner or steward of a forest, the different ways that they can go about protecting and preserving them. But overall, I think care and concern for future generations is the very first step to protecting and preserving old growth forests. So we have to have that baseline, whether it translates to policy or bringing in a forester to create a forest management plan to ensure that we have a rich, full, living forest for future generations is that first step to protecting and preserving. Then we get into the really nitty-gritty details of policy, whether your town has a town forest and your council might set up a way of making sure that that forest is well protected, or a landowner who wants to make sure that their children are treating that forest right. They might put a conservation easement in place on their land, something like that. So it's a combination of intention and getting things down on paper that makes sure that people are treating that forest responsibly in the future.
Why is it important to protect and preserve old growth forests?
Well, old growth forests are some of our richest, both biologically and culturally, parts of forests across the country. So they really pull their weight in so many ways ecologically in terms of supporting many, many species, sequestering and storing carbon for a really long time, both above ground in these big, beautiful, huge canopies of these trees and below ground in the complex fungi and microbial communities in that soil. So we have, and they do amazing things for filtering air and water. So we benefit ourselves immensely by protecting these forests, but also we owe it to these communities of life that are non-human to protect them. And we also are responding to a severe lack of this forest type on our landscape. And it does take generations to restore it. So that's why we are jumping feet first in this work right now to make sure that on the scale of every county, we have a forest that can be restored to this old growth condition. Now, not every forest across the landscape is going to be in that age. That's the way forest succession works, is we're going to end up with disturbances that come in and they create these younger forests that move through their life and come back to this age. And so we have this beautiful patchwork quilt of ages of forest across our landscape, and it's slowly shifting colors and things like that. And we want to make sure that that is still going on too. But with so few old growth forests left, which is roughly 1% of what we once had in the East and 3 to 5% in the West, depending on how much of Alaska you're considering in that. That's abysmal. We have so much to do to get back to what our landscape once had.
Plus, they're really pretty.
Oh, yeah. I could go on and on about what you feel when you walk through an old growth forest and what you see. Those benefits to our spirituality, our wellness, our ability to connect to nature and connect with other people in nature are absolutely enhanced by being in an old growth forest.
You talked about how few there are left. What's the cause of their destruction?
So primarily there was a large logging boom that happened in the 19th century as European settlers spread westward across the United States. Trees were consumed to make that happen. And so with that also we saw forests converted in terms of development and largely to agriculture in a lot of areas. And some forests have returned from where we no longer needed that area for agriculture so heavily. Those forests showed their resilience and they regrew. But largely, even to today, we're seeing logging and older forests as their primary source of destruction. And part of this is because we're not cataloging and inventorying our old growth forests. And so when a forest is logged without particular care for those really unique conditions, it's lost before we even know what we had.
It's funny too, because we so aggressively logged Pennsylvania, where we took out nearly any tree that was left standing. I'm surprised that we have any old growth forest in Pennsylvania with how aggressively we logged.
Yeah, I was also surprised you've got Sylvania in your state name, which means forest. Nobody said, y'all might need to change that.
What's the status of old growth forests nationally and here in Pennsylvania?
I would consider it an extremely endangered community within a forest, with such a small number left. And there, until recently, hasn't been any consideration of blanket protection for them. We do see some blanket protections starting to come to things like state legislatures or a recent national executive order. Not necessarily blanket protection, but at least consideration of some sort of rule or policy to help us preserve these forests, not necessarily within a singular forest, but across all of our national forests or Bureau of Land Management lands. So it's definitely not a protected area itself. It's something that we have to work really hard to be recognized and included in things like forest management plan protections. Usually they're not explicitly considered. So I would say the status is definitely absolutely endangered and extremely vulnerable. Pennsylvania has given us hope, though, because the Pennsylvania DCNR really cares about these forests and has a beautiful system of state lands that include natural areas. And those natural areas are incredibly valuable for us, raising up that ecological value above many other values and making sure that we have these areas that we've prioritized for their natural beauty and their ability to maintain life on their own. We don't need to go in and do anything in these areas. They've got it figured out.
You spoke earlier about having an inventory. Do you have a sense of how many acres old growth forests occupy?
I do not, and I very much wish I did. So it's something that nobody quite has that information. And there's been some good regional studies, but everyone uses slightly different methods, and so we can't necessarily stitch all of them together easily. And then we recently had an inventory done on National Forests and Bureau of Land Management lands. And that actually told us on National Forest lands that 18% of the area they consider old growth, which I was so pleased to hear. And that it's great that they now have that inventory. But we have so much privately owned land across the country that may be holding these pockets of really, really valuable old growth forests that we'll never know about. So we are collecting some of that information as we go on, but it's very hard to also set a line down between where area is old growth and where it's younger, unless you have that really well documented history there.
And if I may add on to Sarah's comment there about the percentage of old growth, with Pennsylvania, it's almost 60% forested land. 70% of that land is in private, non-industrial landowners. So that almost underscores the concern. We don't know what lies on those lands as well as we do on the state forest or state parks. So that's why, again, part of our mission is this educational mission to raise awareness of how important old growth forests are to their communities and to the ecosystems they support.
Brian, what can you tell us about Pennsylvania's ancient forests?
Well, as Sarah noted, the state DCNR and the state itself is very committed to old growth forest preservation on public land. So, the state natural areas, no logging or cutting of any sort is permitted, which is great news. That's in code, it's in state code. The state is very rich, as Sarah said. The state's been logged. It's probably been logged more than once, probably twice. But some of the most remarkable old growth forest stands still remain, particularly in areas that have deep drainage divides and ravines that contain a lot of the old growth trees, such as hemlocks. So, the state has 124 state parks, about 300,000 acres of that state park. And within some of those state parks, there are old growth forests, and we've been adding them slowly to our network, working very closely with the Pennsylvania DCNR to help us identify the best examples. And as Sarah said, we also have very committed regional volunteers who assist us in the counties where they live or adjacent counties to go out and inventory and help us to identify them and walk them and nominate them. And then we work closely with the state forest manager to learn more. And very frequently, these foresters have really rich knowledge and deep knowledge of the history of these forests. And they have sent me and forwarded me really old photographs and pictures of it being logged in the early 1900s and then ending the logging. So really good documentation so we can really understand the depth of these old growth forests. Pennsylvania right now is neck to neck with Ohio in terms of our network. We have 28 state forests, 28 dedicated old growth forests in the state of Pennsylvania and 28 in Ohio. Ohio will eclipse them on October 4th and 5th with 2 more, but we have another couple running behind in Pennsylvania we're trying to bring in. So we have this healthy competition. Of course, it's almost like the Pittsburgh-Cleveland thing where there's a little bit of, back and forth between which city is better. So we always enjoy that. And we have members in both communities who have origins in each state. So it's been kind of a fun dialogue when we have a ceremony or a hike.
That's got to be the nicest rivalry I've ever heard of, though.
Listen, we cannot lose to Ohio. That is totally unacceptable.
This is so funny. It's exactly what I keep hearing. And I have a couple of volunteers who have said, well, I have to admit, I live in Pennsylvania, but I'm from Cleveland, but I'm not going to say that too loud. So
for people that haven't experienced it before, what is it like to walk through a old growth forest? What are some of the sights you're going to see?
I think one of the first things that I notice about an old growth forest is the sounds. So when you start out on a trail and you get into the woods, oftentimes you depart from that paved surface or that gravel surface or anything particularly crunchy, and you get into this very soft layer of duff of needles, especially in a hemlock forest. This is so, so wonderful that you stop hearing the footsteps underneath you. And when you stop hearing your own footsteps, because the trail is so soft with hemlock needles, you kind of feel like you're suddenly just floating through this forest. And you get to tune in to the birds. The birds can be magnificent as you're walking down a trail in an old growth forest, because these forests offer habitat for many species of birds that rely only on older forests. So you might hear the very distinctive hammering of a woodpecker that is building its nest in the cavity of a decomposing tree. And in a heavily managed forest, that there are going to be so far fewer of those trees left standing to die naturally and become habitat for other species. You are going to hear a lot more insect life and possibly even less human voices, because everyone gets this sense of calm that comes over them, and you just want to kind of silently move through this forest in reverence. And then you also really get to engage your sense of smell, the richness of the moisture and the soil. It's things that we don't yet have the tools to explain in terms of the types of compounds that are coming from forests that have grown extremely complex. They can have an effect on us, lower our heart rate, give us a less feeling of stress and anxiety. And so that sense of calm comes over you. And then it's truly a feast for the eyes after that, because there's nothing as awe-inspiring as just coming upon a big tree, especially when you didn't expect it there. And so revering these huge trees, or extremely tall trees where that canopy is so far up that you feel like you're in a cathedral. And then you can zoom in on little things like lichen and moss and fungi, things that you probably have never seen in a younger forest, because it takes so long for their habitat to be created in these older forests. They rely on microclimates and very moist environments. And so it truly is a feast for the senses when you go into these forests. And that's what I tune into when I go on an old growth forest walk.
It's funny, the first experience I had for an old growth forest was Cook Forest State Park here in Pennsylvania. And it was one of those, I just kind of stumbled on it. And all of a sudden I'm seeing signage for Forest Cathedral. And I was like, what is this? I was like, they built a church in the middle of the forest. And then once I started reading more and more, I was like, this place is so spectacular. Then I started doing more research about it. I wonder if there's any more in Pennsylvania. And the fact that we have these incredibly special places so close to us in so many different areas, I think is a amazing calling card for our Commonwealth.
I think one of the things that Pennsylvania strikes me with is the age and breadth of the hemlock forests that remain there. I mean, they are threatened by the woolly adelgid, but the sheer I've never seen, I'm from Virginia, that the magnitude of the hemlocks up there is pretty awesome. The other thing I would add to Sarah's thing is the amount of fallen woody debris all over the forest and decomposing ancient trees. I mean, just to see these things, it's funny, I was on a hike this weekend in West Virginia, and there was an enormous chestnut tree that had fallen, probably he thought 50 years prior, hadn't decomposed at all, because chestnut's so durable. But then we also saw these ancient, really huge fallen ash that have succumbed to emerald ash borer. But the girth of these trees lying across the thing, and then what's living on them now, the fungi, we saw these jack-o'-lantern fungi, and just, it was fascinating seeing all these things. And Sarah mentioned the smells, and those things smell horrible when they're decomposing. But it was really remarkable just to see not only the life of the forest above you, but then on the ground, what's living there. And that's true in Pennsylvania. I've seen, many of those trees, across the scattered woody debris, a real indicator of ancient forest. I think one of my favorite forests I visited is the Hemlocks Natural Area in Snyder County. That's a remarkable hemlock preserve. I think even the owner, before it was deeded over to the DCNR, understood the importance of these trees and never had cut them. Part of Tuscarora State Forest, and really remarkable setting. And as Sarah said, spiritually, you're just changed when you go into them. Our founder, Joan Maloof, people, we have all these definitions and terms, and list of things to look for. And then she says, sometimes you just have a sense that you're in one. And that's a very true guide. I think sometimes you suddenly things feel very different. Sarah said your feet feel different, the sounds are different, the smells are different, and suddenly you're seeing these monstrous diameter trees. So those are all part of it. And again, Pennsylvania is remarkable with the quantity of forest land that it has. And then we keep trying to work across the 67 counties. We're already 28. We'll be 30 by October or November. So we're almost halfway there. And one of the things I always make a plea for when I'm speaking to Pennsylvanians, if you live in a county and look on our website and see we do not have a forest there, we'd love to hear from you. We have a wonderful form online. You can nominate a forest or tell us about a forest where you've traveled that you suspect may be old growth or that you've read has old growth. And we'd love to learn more and engage our volunteers to help us dig a little deeper and go in and photograph it. I have a wonderful volunteer in Dauphin County, and she's headed out and done 3 forests, not all in her own town. We brought 2 into the network, but she's a professor, and when she has time, she heads out and with her dog and her husband, and they check out these places for us, and she sends me documentation, and then I follow up with the manager of that forest, and we start talking about it and learning more. So a plea to Pennsylvanians: look on our website and check out our map and the counties and the listed forests, and we'd love to hear from you.
Brian, how are protection efforts going in Pennsylvania?
As I said, I think they're going very well with the DCNR, and Secretary Cindy Dunn has been a remarkable supporter of our work. But because we don't, and again, we have a list, we're working closely with the Forestry Bureau as well as state parks to keep moving through the recommended list. But there are threats. I mean, there are threats with adjacent development. On a parcel adjacent to a state park, you can have development that really can alter the nature and character of that forest. If trees are taken down nearby and wind patterns change or drainage patterns change. And then with 70% of the land not being in public hands, that's another concern. Although I will say we have some remarkable volunteers and supporters of our group who are very responsible forest managers who have identified old growth forests that are private as well as ones in their own community, and they meet regularly and try to direct and help steward efforts that forest managers make the right decision of their own private land. So I think there's movement afoot. So particularly with the federal initiative, the term old growth is becoming much more an everyday term that people are hearing, reading in the newspaper or hearing on a podcast such as yours. So I do feel that people are becoming more aware of why these are significant, and I'm hoping Pennsylvania will respond accordingly.
And Christian, we have another program. So our flagship network focuses on publicly accessible forests, which could be publicly owned or privately owned when people like a nonprofit have their forest open to the public. But for people who are private woodland owners, who have old growth forests or want to have it return to their forest, we have a private forest registry where we celebrate people who've made that commitment to keep their forests protected to some degree for the sake of old growth. And that lets us engage with that other piece of the puzzle where we don't have state managed lands or anything like that, but people still very interested in old growth forests. And that lets us consult with them to a degree and encourage them to say, if you hire a forester to assess your land, ask them about what you can do for old growth, where you should concentrate your preservation efforts, what streams on your property could really benefit from that intense protection, that kind of thing. So there's all sorts of opportunities for protecting these forests, and beyond just the state lands, we want to see counties and townships committing to this too. Preserving a forest on maybe city property for future generations can be a hugely valuable asset in terms of just the health of a community.
We also been really benefited as well from some great partners in Pennsylvania. The Keystone Trails group have a lot of hikers who are out across the state, and they work with us to make our mission known, and they're very supportive of our work. There's also the Pennsylvania Parks and Forest Foundation, also aware of our work and letting their members help them to understand the old growth forest. And then some wonderful land trust. I mean, the Lancaster Conservancy down in both York and Lancaster County, they brought in beautiful Otter Creek last spring in April or May, I believe. And again, they've made their constituents aware of the importance of old growth forests. So it's those sorts of partnerships that we also welcome. So not only the municipalities, but other land trusts and groups that might have a parcel that has old growth, and to work with us to recognize it is it's a very beneficial partnership. Again, spreading the mission, spreading the education about what we do.
What's the process like working with private landowners? Is it easy? Is it hard? Is it contentious?
We get the right audience that comes to us, people who do want to care for their forests, and folks like that are incredibly wonderful to work with and easy to work with. And probably the harder part of working with private landowners is some of the protection options like conservation easements that pass along to future generations or stay with a property, things that are legal documents, can be rather costly. And there are fantastic other organizations out there that support the putting a conservation easement onto a property. But we don't do that ourselves, but we're there to support that landowner when they say, I want this to be a forever wild property, not necessarily just protected from development, but I want to see this as a beautiful, wild, robust forest for future generations. We'll talk to them about what kind of specific language can go into your easement that promotes that for your forest.
I'm assuming then that you're not wasting your time going to logging companies that purchase land that say, well, if you really turn this over to us, it'd be kind of great.
No, we do make appeals to them saying that, everywhere could benefit from a core protected area where you have vulnerable things like wetlands or streams, that kind of area. But we absolutely acknowledge that working forests are out there. They're a part of our landscape. There's a place for them, but there's also a place for protected older forests that don't see this logging, in at least hopefully in our lifetimes.
We also do get a fair number. I get a fair number of inquiries from concerned citizens about a threatened forest, not necessarily old growth near us. And we have an amazing website with some great materials on it that help citizens develop a campaign to preserve a forest of any type that may be threatened in their neighborhood. So, I would urge people to take a look at our materials online. But there's could be a how to save a forest toolkit with a poster and steps to help someone maybe approach their municipality or the owner of that land about strategies to preserve this. So there's other types of forests that are worth preserving that may not come under our category, but we try to direct people towards those resources.
Where's the largest stand of old growth trees here in Pennsylvania?
I believe it's up in Tionesta State, way up on the border of New York. And we did that's a USDA held federal tract that is bona fide old growth virgin forest, not ever logged, 400 to 500-year-old species. I believe most of it hemlock. And that is the largest and probably best example. And I think the second one that's remarkable, but maybe not as large, is the Cook State Forest, as you mentioned, the cathedral there. I think Pymatuning State Park is the largest of the state parks. We recently brought the Ohio side of that into the network with a remarkable old growth forest there. It's known for its lake and the boating and the fishing there, but this off the beaten path old growth forest was incredible in Ohio. So I would assume there may be a similar resource on the Pennsylvania side. Haven't quite researched that yet, but those are three that I think are really remarkable members of the forest community in Pennsylvania.
Well, I think that's a perfect lead into, do you have any recommendations for people that want to see old growth forests? We're talking about it. Where should people visit?
Well, I mentioned my favorite one so far, which I haven't visited all 28, I will admit. But the Hemlocks natural area, I think the York Otter Creek Preserve down in York County, which is pretty close to the urban areas, is an absolutely stunning park and landscape along the Susquehanna. Really gorgeous. And Tionesta is remarkable. Those, and our website, as Sarah said, we give really good descriptors, So depending on someone's ability, some of the hikes are rigorous, to get into some of the ravines, and other ones are really remarkably accessible and easy for maybe a 1 to 2 hour hike without too much stress. So those are three that I have really found very remarkable and heard lots of comments on. And other ones, again, I would say look at our website and find the county closest to your home or your destination, and you'll probably find something that appeals. And hopefully we'll be filling in all those blocks and get at least 50 of them into the network in the next couple of years. So,
And I also want to note that if you want a good staycation for the state of Pennsylvania, just plug all these points into a road trip and it'll be an amazing road trip.
Yeah, looking at the list that you had online, I was surprised just by how many have already been preserved and how many are in state-owned lands. Because if this podcast mainly focuses on our state parks and our state forests, and I was wondering, I wonder if there's a couple, and always I look and there's way more than a couple. There's so many available to everybody. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of what you both do and what your organization does is that makes them publicly available. It's easy to fall in love with something that's very, very far away that you'll never see. But it's really important to be able to see the places that are being preserved and experience something that people experienced 100 years ago.
You hit that nail right on the head. That's exactly what intention is. And there is sort of an equity component to our work. We do want people within a reasonable distance of their community to be able to approach and understand these forests and walk through them, not to, as you said, not to have to take an expensive vacation or a long trip. So, we keep trying to reach deeply into these communities and find good examples close to home.
And there's such a sense of rootedness, literally, but also metaphorically, when you know that a forest that had the trees that you grew up climbing is going to be there for possibly your children or grandchildren or beyond that. There's something really special about connecting with these local species and really strengthening that sense of place through the forests around you, and especially when you're able to celebrate them nationally too with a recognition like the Old Growth Forest Network.
Yeah, I may never go see everyone, but I'm glad they're all there. I'd like both of you to answer this question. Are you hopeful for the future of old growth forests?
I'm very hopeful because I'm able to see how much they matter to individuals. And while many people may not know that really special connection that you feel to an old growth forest, it can be remedied just by taking someone into one of them. It's as simple as that. I've seen people learn about old growth for the first time at one of our induction celebration walks. And they walk out a very reverent supporter of these forests. So knowing that change can happen so quickly makes me very hopeful that we'll have a large group of committed citizens to having our old growth canopy return to our landscape.
And I feel similarly to Sarah. I feel optimistic. And the day that we actually bring a forest into the network is usually the most wonderful day, because we're surrounded by sort of a legion of people who all believe these are such important places. And our small staff and nimble work is great, and we work really hard to be focused in our regions. But it really comes down to like who's supporting us in the communities. And when we go on a hike and there's 50 local people with various birding groups, or people like the Pennsylvania Outdoor Corps sends regularly its volunteers to our openings. And you see these young people in their early 20s, who are going to make careers in these types of woods. You get very optimistic that it's not just me and my organization, but there's a whole group of people standing behind this work who care about it, who will continue to monitor that forest for us as well. So those are really remarkable moments, and that's what makes me optimistic. Again, and the raised awareness nationally right now, the term being used much more frequently. People are diving in and trying to learn more.
Sarah, where can people go to support your work and learn more about the Old Growth Forest Network?
I highly encourage people to go to our website. It's oldgrowthforest.net. representing the Old Growth Forest Network. And that's where you can explore all of the ways to engage with our work, view our national map, all of the states broken down to the counties with the forests, and all of that information about how to visit them and what to look for while you're there that is extra special. You can also sign up to get communications from us. And if you do that, you will receive invitations to these events in your inbox. And so when there's a forest ceremony that we're having in your state, in the state of Pennsylvania, you'll receive that invitation. We'd love to see your listeners show up and help us celebrate old growth forests. And then if you want to share your knowledge, you can also nominate forests that you may know about or sign up to be one of our county volunteers to help us scout out these locations. We're also on social media, so you can find us on Facebook and Instagram as Old Growth Forest Network.
Thanks so much for talking to us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Christian.
It's been great to have this opportunity, and thanks for your interest in the work we do. Thanks, Christian.
I want to thank my guests Sarah Adlew and Brian Kane for joining the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook for more information about upcoming episodes. You can support the podcast by buying merch or donating on our website. This has been Hemlocks to Hellbenders. I'll see you out there. Hosting, production, and editing by Christian Alexandersen. Music by John Sauer. Graphics by Uncle Traveling Matt's Random Expedition.